All right, welcome everyone. We're going to kick off our Impacted Community session with a keynote speaker, and to introduce him, we have William Wang, who is the chair of the session. But I also forgot to announce this morning, and Steve reminded me, Happy International Women's Day.
Thank you. It is my great honor to introduce today's keynote speaker. And today's keynote speaker is Professor Desmond Upton Patton, who is a Senior Associate Dean and also Professor of Social Work and Sociology. He's also Associate Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Data Science Institute. Let me share with you just a personal story. I haven't met Desmond in person yet, but I heard about his work for so many years, specifically from my collaborator, Kathy McEwen at Columbia University. So Desmond did a lot of very influential work in understanding gang violence, specifically using social media data. And it is really our great pleasure to introduce Desmond as our keynote speaker today. So please welcome Desmond for the keynote speech.
Good morning, and so sorry that I'm not there with you, but I am so grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today about some of my work. And today I really want to focus on the role of social work in AI and data science. And my hope is that you leave this conversation with renewed or new interest in collaborating and partnering with social workers in your data science endeavors. So I want to start off with just kind of a quick story. I had a chance to speak with Greg Epstein. He's a well-known Harvard and MIT chaplain who was on sabbatical as a tech writer for The Crunch. And he was investigating stories about the ethics of technology and business. We spent over an hour discussing research at the intersection of social media and gun violence and how social work could help. What I appreciated most about that conversation was the centering of social work as a transformative discipline and driver of ethical development of AI technologies. Posing a question of achieve social work in AI space redistributes power and reimagines a world where social work thinking, practice, and science has the potential to redirect the serious challenges where experiences of technology is sold as for good could potentially cause more harm, erode democracy, and exacerbate oppression for those most vulnerable. So my hope is that we're all thinking about what would it be? What would it mean to have a chief social worker in a data science space? I believe social work should be at the forefront of technology design along with partners in data science and computer science. I think that we have a lot to say about development and deployment of real-world applications of technologies. And so I would like to posit the idea of social work thinking as an apparatus of social change within the context of algorithmic design. Social work thinking leverages the National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics, ideas like honoring the dignity and worth of every person, centering the importance of human relationships, and engaging in trustworthy practices that anchor how social work thinking can be applied for ethical AI and data science work. In fact, I think social work thinking might have been useful in Google's recent challenges with facial recognition systems. So what we know is that Google has had a long-standing challenges with the deployment of AI across the board. One of the stories that's most memorable for me is their application of how to diversify their data set for a facial recognition system. And so they attempted to hire folks who are experiencing homelessness to collect facial scans, and they wanted to pay those individuals for their participation. And so while perhaps the intent was good, there was a lot of harm and ethical concerns at bay. Number one, there was a lack of informed consent, a lack of protection of confidentiality, and a lack of concern for the general well-being of those participants. And so what is clear to me as kind of an adjacent person in this space and an observer and a participant is that over the last few years, it's become really popular to pursue AI for good. Ideas that suggest solving longstanding social problems with diverse community members that were once too hard to approach with traditional research methods is all the rave right now. Academic institutions and technology companies have invested vast resources in using AI to deepen our understanding of how society works with goals like improving well-being and creating more technologies that work for all. If you take a look at those websites, though, the websites of the organizations, of big tech companies and academic institutions, you'll probably have a hard time finding individuals that represent diverse and complicated lived experiences. So according to AI Now, 18% of authors at leading AI conferences are women, and more than 80% of AI professors are men. The numbers are even more dire with respect to race. And at Google, the company that we've been talking about for a few minutes, only 2.5% of the workforce is Black, while Facebook and Microsoft both hold steady at 4%. So we have an inclusivity problem, and we have a problem with how do we recruit and sustain diverse applicants and diverse employees in these spaces as well. So the lack of inclusion within and around AI spaces may also explain how racism becomes baked into algorithmic code. Perpetuation of racial hierarchy is through the means of technology and algorithms. Biases that exist outside of technology are implicitly coded into software, therefore perpetuating racial bias. And we have learned so acutely about this issue through the work of Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who defines and has labeled this particular issue the new Jim Code. One of the ways in which this has played out and has really, for me, exemplified the harm is for this individual, Robert Williams, right? Robert Williams is from Farmington Hills, Michigan, right outside of Detroit, and was arrested because a facial recognition system said that he looked like another Black man and that he apparently stole a watch, but the video that was used was grainy, and when this system was challenged, the police officer said, well, I guess the computer got it wrong. And so not only was there harm done when this individual was investigated, brought in, it had long-standing effects on his psychology, his well-being, and the well-being of his family, right? And so when we have AI systems that misfire, that misinterpret, that are racially biased, the harm can be thought as being impacted through systems, through families, and through communities, and through societies, right? It's not just one individual that is potentially harmed. So this is the case that I would hope that we think about as something that we definitely want to avoid. So I think that we should be concerned about the lack of voices representing Black, Latinx, and Native folks in the US, particularly in the US context. Individuals from all socioeconomic classes, individuals with less than a college degree or past justice involvement. These folks are very much lacking in the tech space. So taking a step back, how might data science and algorithms and how they're designed impact society in more positive ways if communities were consulted more often, paid and recognized as integral to the development and integration of these technologies that aim to improve life for all? We are trying our best to make a contribution in this space. We do this through the SAFE Lab, for which I direct. I am the founding director. The lab is focused on examining the ways in which youth of color navigate violence on and offline, draw on computational social work approaches and qualitative methods and communication theories to understand the mechanisms of violence and how to prevent and intervene in violence that may occur in neighborhoods and in social media environments. And so here's our approach. We spend a lot of time trying to define the problem. We want to make sure that the application of data science and algorithmic systems is being applied to a problem for which it fits, right? And so that issue for us has been gun and gang violence, trauma, grief, and loss. And a lot of these ideas and themes that we have processed have come from young people and young adults. We spend a lot of time annotating and labeling data, probably more than any of you would like to spend. But we have found that the annotation and labeling process might be the saving grace for how we might have algorithmic systems that think like diverse communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we spend a lot of time partnering with community members, in particular youth, to help translate and interpret social media content that then enables us to have a more contextually driven and community driven annotation and labeling process. In addition to that, we use an inductive close read qualitative strategy when annotating data. So in our lab, we move beyond binary classifications from 0 to 1 or yes or no or positive or negative, and really try to induce meaning, right? We apply qualitative thinking to think about what is being said here. Are we the experts? Do we know what's being said? And what other kind of critical reflexive questions might we ask of the data to help us understand deeper meaning in this space? And then we hire and train annotators that are outside of academia to be a part of that process to not only translate language, African American vernacular English in deeper context, but to also be a check on whether or not our approach is appropriate, whether or not we have the appropriate insights to make decisions on labeling as well. Our annotation process has a number of steps. We select annotators. We have 2 sets of annotators that we normally work with. MSW students that have experience with working in diverse communities, working with young people or in the criminal justice system. We also work with domain experts. These are normally young people who are adolescents or emerging adults who have expertise and lived experience that helps us to unpack how we may interpret a post, a text or emoji or a video in our work as well. We didn't go through a month-long training around annotation, right? That usually involves thinking about various places for which we can derive resources and additional information with contextualizing the post. And then they go through a week-long immersion that's basically a simulation of labeling and annotation before they apply any label or code to a particular social media post. And then we practice and give feedback. We have lots of PhD students and postdocs that are giving feedback to our annotators as well through this process. And again, this is an example of the type of process that we engage in with our work with our computer scientists. I'll speak more about this as well, but we have a very close interaction where we're constantly having conversations about what we're seeing. We're then checking the automated processes that may produce, a set of labels automatically that could misfire, be misinterpreted. We're having difficult and complicated conversations about racial bias in that process as well. But, this work was fundamentally changed for me when I encountered Jakira Barnes. This is the first article that introduced me to Jakira. She was a 17-year-old self-identified female member of a gang located on the south side of Chicago. Jakira created the Twitter account Taekwon Assassin to memorialize her friend Taekwon Tyler, who was killed by a rebel gang in 2013. Jakira posted over 27,000 tweets from December 2011 until her death on April 11, 2014. She used the account to express events of her daily life, ranging from friendship and love and happiness to trauma and gang violence and grief. So let's take a moment to pause and read the headline. This headline, unfortunately, would become the filter by which I understood and interpreted Jakira in my earlier work. My analysis begins with Jakira's digital grave. I attempt to predict her death. I attempt to predict if her death might instigate aggressive communication from her Twitter friends towards rival crews and cliques. I have no interest in Jakira's life story because I do not believe there's anything to know beyond the violent narratives. I've read the violent narratives that I've read in the news. However, to set her friends' reactions to her death in context, I take a peek back at Jakira's tweets. For fun, I partner with data scientists and we use artificial intelligence to find patterns in her posts. I'm compelled to trace them back a little farther. As I read through what turns out to be 27,000 entries, I slowly see a Jakira I don't expect. Tweets about love, joy, happiness, pain, trauma, and sorrow dominate her page. Her own words portray a complex, realistic individual who's drastically different than the national news articles that I imbibed. This story is really important to me because it also represents an example of where I went wrong as a researcher. You see, I had spent so much time and energy imbibing white, toxic, white supremacist ideas of this young Black girl, reading stories about her that painted her solely as a negative, bloodthirsty killer, that I didn't ask reflexive questions around whether or not this narrative was true and how my imbibing one particular isolated narrative impact how we translate her tweets, how we interpret meaning, how we label tweets, and how that then informs the automatic process to scanning her thousands and thousands of tweets from her and individuals in her network. So the problem started off with the question. And so it's been really important to me to slow this work down, to engage in more thoughtful and reflexive processes, even as a Black gay man, to check what I bring to this interpretation and to put it on the table and to allow it to be a way of triaging, of triangulating ground truth in this space. So where I started is what I found. I found lots of posts that were related to violence and aggression. Vernon, that's the gun line, you cross a unit on the headlines. Sing-songy posts that are oftentimes examples of or remnants of drill music lyrics that one might imbibe as well. But then as I dug deeper, as I set my pride and my expertise aside, I began to see another Jakira, someone who had so much pain and love and fear that oftentimes drove the aggression that she exemplified on social media. So saying things like, my struggle ain't never been told. These are things that I wouldn't expect to find or wouldn't even look for because of the questions that I was initially asking of the data. But here, the secret sauce to getting to the other side of this, right, for humanizing Jakira is to understand that I am not the expert in the space, that we need to reimagine expertise. And expertise doesn't mean PhD or social scientist, but it could mean lived experience, right? The pain of having someone who has lost their life because of gun and gang violence. So these are young people that we have hired in our lab to be domain experts. We pay them the same rate we would pay a PhD student. And we work with these young people by partnering with community violence programs and reentry programs. And we spend a lot of time building relationships with mentors in that space, executive directors and outreach workers to ensure that we have a process where the young people feel supported, and that if at any point they want to pull out or they no longer want to do this work, that they still have opportunities to learn, to understand research, and to get something out of this process as well. And so here, we recognize our lack of knowledge regarding the hyperlocal language that we derive from Jakira and the broader context surrounding our analysis of tweets, right? And the challenge is here, the misinterpretation of tweets over identifying innocuous language and threatening that may have detrimental consequences for the population for which we're trying to work with, right? And so our solution in the lab has been to have a really robust and ethical annotation process and again, to hire young people. And so we've created a whole process with how we work with domain experts, right? We have traditionally worked with Black youth as domain experts to create a more robust understanding of context and to leverage their backstories to help us understand context. But this isn't easy, right? This isn't something you just go out and do. It's something that you should really think about very carefully. Some of the challenges have been our domain experts have lives outside of academic work. And when life happens, they needed to attend to their personal needs. And so to overcome that, we would create a mentoring system within the organizations they were connected with to ensure that when things happened, they needed bed, they needed food, a parent was arrested, that they would have the support that they need to get through the work that we were doing together. One of the key things that we learned from working with young people in this space is that we didn't know what the hell young people were saying online, right? We had no process for centering their voices and for making sure that we understood as accurate as possible what was being said. And so with young people, we created a methodology called CHASM, which is the contextual analysis of social media. And this is a 7-step procedure that allows us to focus on context and nuance and culture in this process of interpreting and analyzing social media posts for future natural language processing and computer vision analysis. And so here we are trying to understand what Jay Smoke and thinking about D-Money means. And when we bring in domain experts and when we bring in context, we understand that this post is about grief, about substance use, and about aggression, right? And so it also, for the social worker in the audience, it allows you to think about a multi-pronged approach for what you might do if you see or encounter a post like this. What might be the intervention now that we now have an understanding there are multiple meanings and multiple things that have been communicated through this post? We also created an annotation system called VETAS in order to create a process that feels like social media, that feels like you're going through a social media platform in order to annotate data. So I'm gonna walk you through a short demo of what that looks like. So here's an example of VETAS in action. The posters, I've been up for like 3 days straight, a couple of emojis. And so we ask the annotator, normally we have the first round of annotation from our MSW students. These are folks that are being trained in social work at Columbia. We ask them to give us a baseline impression, no context, no nothing. What's happening in this post? And here the annotator says, he hasn't slept in days. That's not helpful. We all could have surmised that. Doesn't give you a lot of information. Then we ask the annotator, okay, go find context. Go find a lot of context. Don't come back until you have gotten as much context as possible. So looking at the post, using web-based resources like Hip Hop Wiki, looking at the author of the post, looking at the peer network, because oftentimes the individual may say they're gang involved and then they're following Disney characters. The discontinuity there is really important. Looking at offline events that may shape language and culture and context, right? What's happening in the neighborhood, what's happening at school, what's happening in the city, what's happening in the world. They may help us understand how we might interpret language. We look at the virality of posts, who's liking, resharing, and how people are engaging with that post. Okay, so now the annotator has done all of that, right? They've gotten as much context as possible, and now they come back and then they reinterpret the post. And now the annotator has a lot more to say. They then say, this user is saying that he's been up for 3 days straight, most likely meaning he hasn't slept in 3 days. This post comes days after his friend was killed. This user may be having difficulty sleeping because of his friend's death, right? So this is more contextual data that we may not have gotten had we not centered this need to derive more context. And now our annotator can go back and label that particular post. The most challenging thing for me as a social work scientist working with data scientists is this need to put things in very neat boxes, but here we are. Our predominant themes of focus are grief and aggression, because these are the themes that emerge the most qualitatively from looking at a subset of social media data. Then everything else was categorized as other. That's really challenging for me, but here we are. And so our annotator is then asked to then label, having done all of that contextual work. But that's not enough. We also want to go back to those domain experts, and we also want to check our disagreements. We want to know, like, are there differences in how the MSW student and the domain expert are looking at data? We want to make sure that we understand why there's disagreement and how we can improve upon our annotation labeling process. Here, I really think that annotation is important, right? That it has to go beyond binary classifications, because if not, the danger and the harm that can be done are too high. And while it's slow, while it is not the most efficient process, the question becomes, then what is the process that does no harm or does the least harm in this space? We've also tested CHASM, right? We wanted to understand, is CHASM helpful when applied to a natural language processing space? And what we found is that it is, right? Having more context, right, allows us to have a more accurate system. So we compared it against an automatic labeling process, and the contextually driven process outperforms. Again, these aren't great scores, but it did do a little bit better than the automatic labeling process. So for me, the question that I keep coming back to is, like, can AI keep young people safe? And can using data science tools, artificial intelligence, partnering data scientists actually keep young people safe? Well, I think that, you know, using these schools could potentially aid social workers and violence outreach workers in their intervention works. And I think it's possible to solve longstanding social problems with diverse community members that were once too hard to approach with traditional research methods. Again, but I think the disadvantage in using these tools, especially with no clear guidelines, without domain expertise, without audits and such, is that we can enact state violence that is enacted by the surveillance of the hyperlocal language and pictures of social media that can be used as evidence or negative character testimony within the criminal justice system. So what I'm working on with colleagues in social work is how do we create a field of translational computational social work, right? And I think a part of that is around the types of questions that we ask of data that inform annotation, that inform how algorithmic systems are designed. And a part of that is rooted in a reflexive process, right? A process in which we actively consider biases, where we check ourselves, where we ask very difficult questions of ourselves in the process of hopefully elucidating harms and challenges, right? So here we want to think about, respecting privacy and the dignity of all subjects. We want to make sure that we're doing the least amount of harm in this process and that our process is inclusive, right? So what is the process of onboarding participants who have a stake in the future of AI, right? And so here we have a set of questions that you might want to think through, right? And so what are questions that you may want to ask a community expert? What might happen if a participant identity is revealed? What's another question you may ask? Please describe the community's previous experience engaging in research. What outcomes would we want to see as a result of the research? Another question, does the community feel heard? Have they felt heard throughout the research process, right? Is the data I'm working with unique to a specific population? Have I consulted with people? In my research, is my research team diverse? Does it look like the world? Does my research team reflect the community I'm studying? Are my research goals established in collaboration with the community? So these are the types of reflective questions that I think are embedded in what I would hope to develop as a translational computational social work field. And so I think a part of this is like redefining and reimagining expertise in artificial intelligence. So when we respect and value diversity of experiences, we create an opportunity to anticipate needs rather than simply responding to them after a crisis. Centering all lived experiences offers a holistic way to move beyond classifying human behavior into these neat bins of data, forcing us to consider who overall gets to participate in AI design and how data is collected and analyzed and the ways in which these systems are deployed, and most importantly, who benefits as well. So just some reflections for you. And these are things that I constantly think about in my own work is like, is data science the right tool for the difficult and challenging research spaces that I'm working in? Am I consistently engaging in extensive and critical conversations, oftentimes difficult conversations with community members that may help me to anticipate challenges and problems? And am I actually engaged in a true partnership to better understand true partnership with community members to better understand how the problem is defined by the community? Thank you so much.
I guess we have some time for questions.
And vulnerable populations are addressed in AI. I hope that everyone that is asking these kind of questions starts to adopt the methods that you are talking about. For those of us who are training people in computer science, how do we help prepare computer science professionals to work and be good partners?
Great question. I missed the first part, but I appreciate what you have mentioned. I think a part of it is, reading outside of your discipline, right? And the more that I spend time in data science and computer science, I realize that that's not necessarily common, right? And I think that a part of it is kind of opening up a conversation around like, have you heard of Ruha Benjamin? Have you heard of Safiya Noble? Are you interacting in these spaces where people are outlining harms that algorithmic systems are creating and having facilitated dialogue? I would love to see computer scientists, having modules in their class where they're reading social science, communication, information science articles, processing them and having difficult conversations, and then asking your students to then reflect back what they've learned in the development of the tools that they may create in your class.
So another question. I love the focus on deeper annotation. That seems something that we should do more of. How do the data scientists or the NLP practitioners that you're working with report inter-annotator agreement scores or those kinds of ways of reporting agreements that you standard see in the literature with this kind of deeper annotation process? I'm interested in that.
So normally, like when we are writing up our findings, the agreement piece is a part of the methodological explanation for the qualitative or annotation piece of the work. So normally when we're writing up a methodology section, we have a section where we talk about the process of labeling and we talk about the agreement that we've had. And that's normally something that I would do. I haven't seen the translations for how that works for my computer science colleagues, but normally our papers are integrated in that way.
Thanks.
There's a question at the back.
Hello. Yeah, I don't know whether you can see me. I'm right at the corner. My question is, there's so much data out there which is already biased. People have been unjustly convicted or denied bail, and those are all recorded, and an AI model will think that this information are true. That's the ground truth data. So my question for you is, like, how can the community help in, or this annotation process can help us clean up this data?
Well, I would take a step back and want to ask you, like, what are your non-negotiables, right? And so if we understand that data systems are inherently biased, then what is our obligation? What is our code of ethics in how we then treat that data? Is this data that we should be using to draw claims about critically long-standing social problems? So I think that I would want to start there as a beginning conversation. I do think that there's a role for annotation. Again, for me, this annotation feels more like an anthropological or ethnographic endeavor. And so what would it mean for you to take a subset of that data and to really process it, and to comb through it, and to find the bones, to find the challenges, to find the errors, right? And to study that, right? What would it mean to study the errors of biased data as a simulation before you actually do anything real with it? And so I would like to see more, I would love to see, and I hope to see, is more kind of combined work with ethnographers and anthropologists and social scientists that can allow us to take a subset of your data and to really think through some of the challenges. And then what could we do together? I don't know what the possibilities are, but that has been, for me, the most fun that I've had with my data science colleagues, is to truly be able to have a strong understanding of the data that we're looking at before an algorithmic tool touches the data.
So I have a question about how we should organize ourselves to achieve some of the things that you've achieved, which is so inspirational, so thank you for that. I'm thinking in part because when I look, and this is probably heresy, but when I look at what has happened in engineering schools prior to the emergence of data science as it relates to society. So for example, we have a department of engineering society. And I think they do good work, but I don't think they necessarily fully influence the engineers that are being turned out over the years. That's probably a heresy. Others may well disagree. But I'm wondering about how, with our various data science initiatives, how we engage the human factor. I mean, you gave examples of how you've set up a lab, and that lab then works with annotators, and it's obviously very successful. Is that the way to go, is to sort of set up these labs that sort of cut across the disciplines, or do you have other thoughts of how we should organize ourselves to really dig into the human factors of what we need to be, of how we need to study these?
Yeah, such a great question. And I mean, I think the lab piece is an important one because it's allowed me to bring in a very diverse group of students from engineering, from sociology, from humanities, from medicine. And I think without that particular organizing mechanism, it would have been harder to do. But I think a part of it, though, is, how do you talk about curriculum and what curriculum is important within the engineering space, right? So I lead curriculum in my School of Social Work, and I had to be intentional and deliberate to say social work needs to be in the data science conversation. And so by bringing that in as a part of a kind of a curricular need, it allowed me to then identify granting opportunities and other collaborations at Columbia, where we've created one of the first data science minors in a School of Social Work. And at Columbia, we have this wonderful mechanism called the Collaboratory Fellowship that allows you to partner with someone in a different discipline to create a curricular experience over a number of years. And so we received $100,000 to create this minor over 3 years. And it intentionally put us in conversation. We could identify the challenges, the curricular challenges between engineering and social work, but without that structure, it would have been much harder to do. So I would definitely try to either identify those types of resources in your own institutions.
Hi, Kristen Eschenfelder, University of Wisconsin-Madison Information School. So thanks very much for your talk. It was great, really, really interesting stuff. Love the methodological deep dive. Your project and your focus on kind of the ethnographic approach to coding reminded me of a paper I saw at the recent iConference, which is the iSchools gathering, where somebody took intercoder disagreement as the starting point of the conversation and like analyzed the snot out of the disagreement and actually started to build structures around what can we usefully do with this disagreement? What does the disagreement tell us? And so it just reminded me of that we can bring different perspectives to various points of the kind of machine learning model development chain that I think opened some really interesting new questions. So thank you for bringing this to us today.
Thank you so much. I love that you were starting with the disagreement. We have a very similar paper that we published in the Hicks conference proceedings a couple of years ago. We didn't start with disagreement. We realized the importance of disagreement, but I like this idea of getting there.
Did you get to go to Hawaii for the Hicks, or was it virtual?
No, I missed the conference, which I regret.
I have a question about intervention, because I think your talk was really inspiring when you talk about how we can come together and look at the annotation, look at how we can improve the existing NLP techniques for understanding and detecting some of the labels that you mentioned. I'm wondering whether you thought about the next step, right? Or for example, intervention. How do we work together to build better mechanisms? And if you can elaborate a little bit, that would be really helpful.
I dream of intervention. I want to intervene. It is why I do this work. I don't do this work because I am a technologist or data scientist. I do this because I wanted to intervene in violence that is amplified on social media. I want to intervene and support young people and adults that are grieving online and don't have a resource. So it is the very thing that I want to do, and it's extremely hard to get funding for it. And so I have gotten pretty far along with R01 grants that just didn't get funded. We're now working on NSF-funded study to study grief online. But I think what's needed, because of the ethical challenges in the population that I work with, if things have to move slower, and there's just lots of challenges with getting that work funded. The grief work was the workaround that I think is going to get us there. But I would love to have spaces where the data is historical, where it's not actively going to harm someone, where we can think through interventions in a safer way without the risk of this data being used in the criminal justice system or used in the healthcare system. So I would love to engage in more kind of experimental and simulated work where we can try out different interventions to see what are the possibilities. I would love to collaborate with folks on that, because I do think, I know that in the work that I do in the communities that I work with, young people are dying because of what they say online. Young people and people generally are experiencing deep and historic amounts of grief and loss as it relates to COVID-19, the anti-Black racism, anti-Jewishness, all types of things that are happening, and these things are just sitting on social media. So I would love to figure that out. So if anyone wants to collaborate, please let me know.
Thank you. There's a question at the back.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. This is very near and dear to my heart, and so I was wondering, I'm at a community college in Maryland, and I wonder if you would be willing to come and speak, not just to my data science folks, but if I could get our psychology, sociology, criminal justice folks to have maybe a town hall where you could come and speak to us about this very topic?
Absolutely.
Woohoo, thank you. That was easy. I just need your contact at some point. Thank
Yes,
you.
I'm sure we can make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Question at the back.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent presentation. I have a quick question. As you know, in machine learning or data science, there is already a lot of open source data available for use, for training, for even teaching a student using those data. So we say all those data, they have some bias, some issues. So my question to you, through your work, have you created any data sets which you can make available for a researcher or even professor even to use your data and maybe compare with another data set which we think are biased and see how the algorithms behave?
Yeah, great question. We initially started off by putting our data set on academic commons, and then we had our reflexive process where we realized this could be really scary and this could be used or misused. And so we no longer share our data publicly, we do share code, right? And so I work very closely with Kathy McEwen. I think, having a conversation with Kathy around the code could easily happen, but because of the sensitivity of the data, the population of the data, we no longer share that corpus.
There's a question at the front.
Hi, Desmond. Thanks again. Name's David Uminski. I'm Executive Director of the Data Science Institute at the University of Chicago. Very proud of where you came from there and the work you're doing. I had one question and then a comment, and hopefully it's a positive update comment from the University of Chicago. First, the question though, you were sort of taking what I thought of was groundbreaking work and like the model cards work and data sheets work, and you've sort of, when you think about that being a good first practice in documenting data and where it's coming from in terms of bias and collection, you're setting out new frameworks to be thinking about that when you consider how you're recruiting your domain experts and things like that. I'm curious if you are thinking about and it looks like you are, and it was a short talk, like a larger framework and sort of the new version of thinking about, really sensitive data, real-time problems. Even before intervention, you're hinting at like I would call it like the next generation of like some of that work was being done, and the model cards work I think you're hopefully familiar with. And then the second.
No, I'm not. Yeah.
Oh, so then I'm gonna So there's a couple papers by Timnit Gebru that I think are worthwhile to look at in terms of recognizing in the mid 2010s that the data is massively biased, but there's things you can do, and you can borrow engineering documentation methodologies to help with this, and it's had a pretty groundbreaking change in certain areas. So then,
awesome.
The first is like, we should talk about that, and happy to do an introduction to her as well. The other comment is we actually have been thinking about our communities in the South Side a lot more with the launch of this Data Science Institute, and we've actually, just as an invitation to come engage, launched a Community Data Fellows program where actually graduate students, by the way, mixture of social work students out of the social work school and data science students, are working as paired teams with local community impact groups that are actually really trying to grapple with how they can think about the problems you've actually are looking at from the online perspective, and they're looking at the ground levels perspective. But love to have you, come and speak to that group. And frankly, I think we have a lot to learn from your work.
We love that. I think that's exactly the kind of efforts I think are critical. I wish that would have been there when I was a doc student there, but I'm so happy to hear that this is happening and happy to connect on it as well.
Thank you very much for eye-opening. Thank you very much for an eye-opening presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I'm adding another invitation to your list.
They turned it off.
Yeah, the mic is not working.
Here we go. Thank you so much for an eye-opening presentation. Really enjoyed it. So I would like to add one more invitation to your busy calendar. I'm Azar Bestavros. I'm Associate Provost at Boston University, Associate Provost for Computing and Data Sciences. And we have a ton of focus on social justice. And you may know that we have the Anti-Racist Research Center that Ibram Kendi has set up. And with the Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences, we have a lot of emphasis on working together on a racial data lab. We would love to have you come. I think it would be our pleasure. So yes, shamelessly using the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would love to. I spent, at the height of the pandemic, I was a visiting researcher at Microsoft Research New England in Cambridge, and hung out a lot at BU and BC. So I had, before everything happened, I was having a really good time. So I would love to come back and redo that.
So there's a question to the right. Are you asking a question? Okay, so I have, so while we're waiting for more questions, I have a follow-up question along this line is, I think the work on Twitter is certainly very timely, but I also noticed the youth, the younger generation, they're moving to different social media platforms. For example, Instagram and TikTok. So they're going from written text to this kind of short videos. And what do you think are the opportunities and challenges when we work on to address social media platforms that require maybe more resources for computing and more resources for annotation efforts?
Yeah, this is exactly why we need to be connected to young people, right? To first understand where folks are moving and why they're moving there. And then the second question is, then how do we access that data? Twitter has always been, I think, a go-to for a lot of us because it's been, for me, the easiest place to collect data. I have not had the easiest time collecting data from other platforms for obvious reasons. So what we've done is started to collect data from individuals about their social media life, right? So what we're doing now is, so we created a website that feels like a social media platform, and we're working with Black Harlem residents, Black Columbia College students to collect narratives around experiences on various social media platforms, and they can apply that thinking to an analysis of a social media platform as kind of an entry point. And so this is one of our workarounds, but I think you're absolutely right that we have to be moving where people are. But also I think there's a question of well, then what does it mean for us to move there? Should we move there as well? So I'm constantly, in this work, I'm constantly questioning, I want to do this, but is that the right thing to do? And then who can help me think through whether or not that's the right thing to do? And so a part of it, I think, is also on your teams, having those people, that individual with a community background or social work background, or developing skill in this space to actually ask these kind of questions as well.
There's a question at the front.
You briefly touched base on one of the challenges of how this is a very powerful tool for intervention, but it can also be used by bad actors for state violence. What are some of your thoughts that you would share with us researchers and technicians on how we can try and safeguard our tools like this from bad actors like that?
Yeah, it's really complicated because it's about intention versus impact, right? And so in my lab, we are very, very wary of who we share data with. We are willing to have conversations. We have conversations about sharing code at times, but because the population is so sensitive and the topic is so sensitive, we basically have a no-share policy, right? So this is something that has become our non-negotiable, and it's something that is also kind of deeply embedded in the values that I hold as a social worker. It becomes complicated because, you know, we all have different ethical guidelines, different value sets, and different ways in which these tools can be applied. And so, but I think a part of it is, like, then what questions are you constantly embedding in your research processes that allow you to at least have the difficult conversation? And I think a part, if we're going to actually like dismantle this, like, wrongdoing of AI systems on society, and then what are we willing to give up? And I think that question is going to be the hard question. There are things that you give up. There are things that you can't do. Data sets you won't use, people that you won't share data with, right? And are you willing to have that conversation? And do people know it? Is it on your website? Is it a part of your IRB? Is it plastered so that people know that when they work with you, they're only going to be able to do so much because you are more concerned about the humanity of the data set and about protecting and safeguarding folks than just, you know, producing technology and producing things because it's the thing to do.
Thank you. There are two questions at the back.
I also have.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. And then you next.
Hi, I just have a question about, while going through your studies, have you run into people that have like multiple Twitter accounts or like the Finsta, the fake Insta, that may give a better insight into what they want to present as versus their actual emotions?
I like where you're getting at. Yes, absolutely. It's not super common, but it definitely has happened. But I see every account as being a representation of multiple selves. And that's actually why I really like social media data more than any other way of collecting data, because I think what I feel is that people are willing to present multiple sides of themselves, even selves that may be untrue or falsified. Could be an aspirational self, could be a fictitious self. And that, to me, is an important way of understanding the human experience, is that we're a bunch of things. We have a bunch of identities, we have various social locations, and I think that every presentation, whether or not it is true or not, is an important piece of data.
Hi, I'm Leah Shanley. I'm at the International Computer Science Institute. My own area of research is around citizen science or community science and the intersection of computational research. There's an amazing project out in New York City called Street Science, where, oh, you're familiar, okay. Where the students and the families are doing the data collection or helping to interpret the data around police. At least when I heard it 5 years ago, we invited them to our White House event. They were talking about looking at the impact of police violence on the families. To what degree are you engaging community members in the coding and the the tagging and such of the data and helping in the analysis of it?
So I'm not a part of the Street Science project, but I do have a project with the Mayor's Office for Criminal Justice that is very similar, where we've been creating a neighborhood navigator to hopefully build stronger trust mechanisms between individuals in our low-income housing apartment complexes and the city. And a part of that is that we have done a couple of things. We added a qualitative component where we did 75 interviews with individuals in NYCHA residents. We created a community advisory board. We also collected social media data, and we had individuals from the community advisory board be annotators for the analysis of the social media data that we collected as well. All these components were things that were not asked for by the city. There are things that we had to demand of the city as well. So a part of it was also being intentional in saying, in order for us to do this work, we cannot do this without community, and we won't do this without community as well.
Hi, this is Kun Lu from University of Oklahoma. I really appreciate your presentation. I think, of course, many people have agreed it's an eye-opening experience, and it's also thought-provoking for me. I do want to follow up, like Christine's comment on the intercoder disagreement, because we're more familiar with the intercoder agreement, which we always want to reach certain level in order to report our result. But the disagreement part is definitely something that has been probably overlooked and started. And I wonder, number one, maybe if we can have some more systematic and thorough study on the disagreement, if there is any systematic disagreement among different population or subpopulation, people groups, people with different background, people with different age groups, or people coming from different communities, right? Number two, I'm thinking maybe probably one way in future, I think it probably has been underdone previously, because when we train machine learning model, we have training data, we want machine learning model to predict something. But one thing has probably been overlooked is the annotator's profile. So who is annotating that? Are they from different age groups, different community? So if the annotator's profile can be something that the model can take into account. The computational model can think about if we need to use annotator's profile to a certain extent when making the prediction, thinking about who is annotating the training data and what is the context of this prediction, right? If the annotator is in a way that can understand the comments, right? Understand the context of the comments. That's probably something maybe we can move to in future to think about incorporating annotators' profile in machine learning models. It's just, I mean, your presentation provoked this thought of mine, just happened just now. I want to share with everyone here.
I love that. Let's do it. Let's do it together. So yeah, send me an email.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again for your time today. My name is Charlie Pegian. I'm at the Data Collaborative in Belmont University in Nashville. We're starting to really look at what the impact that we can have on the community is. If you were to create your dream team, is this thing still on? Can you hear me okay?
I can, you're
okay,
good.
Sorry. If you could create your dream team of different types of experts to work on some hard problems, whether it's the person in sociology or urban planning or what would the different expertise disciplines be that you would want on a team going after these hard problems?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I really like medical models because they understand that you have to treat the whole person and the whole body. I think I would add that it's not just about treating individuals as it relates to data, but also communities, right? So I would want to have expertise that thinks about individuals across systems, right? So I want, the social worker, the engineer, the person that thinks about neighborhoods and streets and architecture, the person that thinks about health and body, the person that thinks about joy and happiness and things that aren't always negative as well. But at the core, the folks that represent the diversity of our lived experience, right? And I think that is what's consistently missing, is that oftentimes, people will bring someone like me in and be like, okay, we're good. We got the Black gay man from Colombia. And I present a very isolated way of thinking about the world. And that became very clear to me when I was looking at a young Black girl in my work. So hopefully we think about people that are outside of the academic context as being equal partners as well.
Okay, one last question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I guess this follows on to the last question a bit, but I'm thinking about your domain experts and other community members that you're bringing into the lab. And how do you signal to them? Because it can be intimidating coming onto a university campus, even for those of us who go on them regularly, going into new labs or new places. What kinds of things do you do, or would you recommend to signal that this is, it is a safe place to come, it's an inclusive environment? What do you think are the key things that you do, or that you would recommend doing to others who are trying to create these types of engagements?
I think it's so, thank you for the question. I think it's so important to level set and to be vulnerable and to be honest and to be transparent. I let them know like why we're here, what I'm thinking, what I think I can and cannot do. I talk about my own fears and my own challenges, how I got to this process as well, that, you know, me coming from Gastonia, North Carolina and being at Columbia was not the plan and probably wouldn't have happened if there were all these other barriers that were in my way, right? So I strongly believe with leading with vulnerability in that space. So that's kind of what I do individually, but this work cannot be done alone, and that I had to have partnership and connection with reentry programs and community violence programs, and to have additional folks that can support me, because there's a lot of complexity out there, right? And so when I mess up, which I will do, I want to create a safety net that a lot of us get to experience, that a lot of people that look like me don't get to experience. And so having that, trying to replicate a safety net has been really important as well.
Thank you. So we are right around the hour mark. So I want to again express my thanks to our keynote speaker.
Thank you.
And now I think we have the break.